Recently, Alex O'Connor was on the Jubilee show to debate 25 Christians, and the very first question they discussed was whether suffering, and animal suffering in particular, makes the existence of God unlikely. And while I will say that I think there were some good points made by the Christian side of that debate, I believe that the biggest problems with O'Connor's arguments were never brought up. So in this video, I'm going to explain what I would have said if I was one of those 25 Christians. What I think is the best way to respond to O'Connor's claim that animal suffering makes the existence of God unlikely. So let's get into it. In order to respond to an argument, we must first understand it. So here's O'Connor explaining his position.
I think when confronted with two hypotheses, so atheism, naturalism, or theism, we should ask what we expect would occur under either hypothesis. And then we look at the world and we see what does actually occur. And what do we find? We find, I think most relevant here, a system of natural selection, the mechanism by which God apparently chose to bring animals and ultimately human beings into existence. A system which is defined by suffering. Survival of the fittest is the same thing as the death and suffering and destruction of the unfit. I'm told that the very mechanism that God chose to bring about the human species as the ultimate end of his creation was one that is imbued with suffering, such that 99.9% of all the species, let alone animals, that have ever existed on planet Earth have been brutally wiped from existence. And I think that that's less likely on theism if you assume atheism or materialism. Not only do you explain this, you also come to expect it.
Maybe God could justify a little bit of animal suffering, but not, O'Connor argues, the overwhelming amount of it built into the fabric of the world. Think about the uncountable numbers of animals that have existed throughout history. Then think about the tremendous amount of suffering those animals must have experienced as they lived and died in a world filled with disease, predators, and natural disasters, all of which could tear an animal painfully to shreds. Why, O'Connor asks, would a good God allow this? Now, the attentive viewer may have noticed that this argument bears some resemblance to another, even more popular argument for atheism, the problem of evil. After all, the problem of evil says that the existence of evil in the world seems to disprove God, since God is supposed to be all good and all powerful. But if he's all good, he would want to prevent all evil, and if he's all powerful, he would have the power to do so. So the fact that he hasn't done it yet seems to suggest that he doesn't exist. The difference, of course, with O'Connor's argument is that he switches out the more general concept of evil for the more specific one of animal suffering. So why might O'Connor have done that? O'Connor chose to focus on suffering instead of evil because he doesn't believe there is such a thing as objective good or evil. He describes himself as an ethical emotivist, or someone who believes that ethical claims are just expressions of our personal feelings towards certain behaviors.
I'm an ethical emotivist, which is a form of ethical non-cognitivism. I don't think that ethical claims have truth value. I think they're expressions of emotion.
This is important because it shows that O'Connor is not necessarily saying that he believes that there is anything wrong with animal suffering, just that animal suffering is a problem for the theist, who does believe in objective goodness. He's giving an internal critique of the Christian worldview and saying that Christianity can't give a consistent picture of the world, even given its own premises. Christians say that good and evil are objective. But if good and evil are objective, then animal suffering must be objectively evil. Therefore, the Christian must say that animal suffering is objectively evil. But why, then, does O'Connor choose to focus specifically on animal suffering instead of human suffering or just suffering in general? The reason is that he admits, at least for the sake of the argument, that an all-good God could have reasons to allow human suffering to exist, since there are good things which can only be brought about by the existence of suffering, like free will or courage.
Christianity has a celebrated tradition of theodicies trying to explain why suffering exists. Yeah. Human free will, the development of the soul, higher order goods, all of this kind of stuff. None of which apply to the suffering of non-human animals.
So by focusing specifically on animal suffering, Alex hopes to cut off some of the traditional rebuttals to the problem of evil before they even get started. And certainly he manages to do that to some extent. But the question then is this. By focusing only on animal suffering, does O'Connor weaken the strength of his charge against God? Is animal suffering really not as bad as O'Connor thinks it is? Remember that O'Connor is offering an internal critique of Christianity. He's taking the premises of Christianity and trying to show that they contradict each other. But it's no secret that Christians believe that human beings have an eternal destiny. Christians believe in the resurrection of the dead for all human beings at the end of time. We're going to live forever, for an infinite amount of time. But if we're going to live for an infinite amount of time, then we have infinite value. That's why what we do in this life is so, so important. But animals, under most traditional Christian views, do not have an eternal destiny. They're not going to live forever. They're going to live for a few years, die, and that's it. They don't come back. This isn't some kind of injustice done to animals. It's just their nature as fully material beings. We're partially immaterial, so we have the capacity to survive death. Animals don't, so they die, and that's it. That's philosophy that goes all the way back to Plato. But if animals only live for a finite amount of time, that means they have finite value. That means that whatever happens to them in this life has a very limited importance compared to the grand importance of what happens to human beings. Indeed, under the Christian worldview, it could be said that any single human being is worth more than the sum total of every animal that has ever existed. Let me say that again. You or me or your friend down the road each have more ontological value just in ourselves than all the dogs, cats, tigers, lions, bears, ants, and dinosaurs that have ever existed throughout the world put together. That's a huge deal. If we are each more valuable than entire races of animals, then everything that happens to us is infinitely more important than what happens to animals. If animals suffer, it's unfortunate. But if we suffer, it's catastrophic. So God could be justified in allowing all of this animal suffering to exist, even if it only brings about a significant change in one human being's life. Say by convincing him that God exists when he sees the grandeur of the created worlds, or by reminding him of his place in the hierarchy of nature, or even by providing a good image for a poet to use in a poem, which may lead a man or two to convert to Christianity and avoid hell. If only one of these things has happened even once in human history, it would justify all of animal suffering from a Christian perspective, because a human being spending eternity with God is an infinitely greater good than millions of animals suffering is an evil. But maybe you find this answer unsatisfactory. I get it. It's hard to grapple with the notion of eternity and exactly what it means for a human being to have infinite value. More importantly, you might be thinking that all of this justifying evil for the sake of a greater good talk seems like a pretty cold comfort to all the animals that are suffering right now. If that's what you're thinking, perhaps I can offer you a bit of a comforting thought. You see, I believe that it is very likely that animals don't experience suffering in the sense that we human beings do. Now, Alex has previously not reacted very kindly to philosophers taking this approach.
It is difficult to express just how disturbing it is to see people still peddling this Cartesian fantasy that animals don't experience pain.
And if my argument was that animals don't feel pain, I would totally understand this frustration. Clearly, animals feel pain. If you kick a dog, he'll yelp and jump away from you. Animals show signs of experiencing pain, so they must really feel pain. But what I'm arguing is that pain is not quite the same thing as suffering. Yes, the terms are sometimes used synonymously. And yes, pain is a necessary condition for suffering, but I don't think it's sufficient for it. The reason for this is that human beings have powers that animals don't have. We have intellects and the ability to grasp concepts. We don't just experience pain, but we have the power to reflect on it intellectually, to draw out and dwell on our physical pain in our minds, which makes the pain so much worse. Here's an example of what I mean. Imagine you break your arm. That'll hurt. You'll be in physical pain because of that. But you'll also be in mental pain because you know that arm breakage was unnecessary, and you'll dwell on the fact that it's not doing you any good. You're suffering. Now, imagine you're working out in the gym. If you're doing it right, you're probably experiencing some kind of physical pain here too. But you probably wouldn't say that you're suffering. Why not? What's the difference between these two cases? The only difference I can see is that in the case of the broken arm, you can't intellectually see the point of your pain, which raises the physical pain to the status of suffering. But when you're working out, you can understand that the physical pain is part of a process towards a good, the good of getting stronger, and you don't really mind the pain because of it. So that brings us back to animals. Yes, animals experience pain, but they don't perceive the pain as pointless because they don't really perceive the pain as anything. They don't really perceive anything as anything. As non-rational creatures, animals are incapable of reflecting back on their own behavior and state of being from an outsider's perspective. Only human beings can do that. So only human beings can really experience the mental agony that elevates mere physical pain into intense suffering. And by the way, to cut off an objection that's often raised to this point, and one that O'Connor himself has brought up before, No, saying that animals don't suffer does not entail that we can do whatever we want to them. But let's look at why O'Connor says this might be an implication.
If animals don't suffer, then there's no issue doing things to them that appear to cause suffering. So if I have a dog, there's no reason why I shouldn't throw that dog on a fire, cut off its tail, and poke its eyeballs out with a fork. I mean, why not? The dog isn't suffering, so what's the problem?
St. Thomas Aquinas argued that even though animals can't suffer, we shouldn't mistreat them, because that would show a kind of malice and an inhumanity on our part towards God's creation. The reason not to be cruel to animals is not necessarily about what it does to the animals, but about what it does to us. So we now have the tools to answer O'Connor's go-to case of animal suffering: the dying deer in the woods. Here he is bringing up this example in his Jubilee episode.
So here's a question. A deer gets its leg caught under the branch of a tree that's fallen over in the wild, and it starves to death in confused agony. Why does God oversee this? And why does God set the natural world up such that events like this occur?
So let's see why the existence of situations like the dying deer are not necessarily evidence against God's existence. First, we can say that whatever is going on with the deer, it's not experiencing the kind of mental agony we usually associate with suffering. It's feeling a kind of intense physical unpleasantness, but that's all. Second, we can safely claim that God is allowing that physical unpleasantness in order to bring about a greater good, either for human beings or for the natural world. And third, we can even go so far as to provide possible answers to what those greater goods in allowing the deer to feel pain might be. There are several possible approaches to take here, but my favorite is to point out that pain, in and of itself, is just biology's way of letting an animal know that there's something wrong with it. That feature is necessary for the animal to survive, and while God could perhaps carve out an exception to it and freeze the animal's pain receptors when it becomes clear that the animal has no hope to survive, that would require God to abandon the laws of nature he set up to work on a regular basis. If he did that, and if we noticed, we might lose hope that the scientific method and its consistent, observable, rationally discoverable laws of nature are rationally discoverable. And indeed, given the infinite value of our lives, it's more important for us human beings to trust that our world is rational than it is for an animal to not feel pain. So that is how I would answer O'Connor's problem of animal suffering. I hope you liked it. If so, I hope you'll consider sticking around to see what other topics I'll cover on this channel. I cover different questions on philosophy, with a special emphasis on the existence of God. If you're into that kind of stuff, or if you just want to learn more about it, please consider subscribing to keep informed about our future videos as they come out. Thank you for watching this video, and God bless.